The entire campus shook, not from an earthquake, but from the force of the helicopter landing right in the middle of it. Students ran to their windows, jaws dropping. Professors froze mid-lecture. Yesterday they had laughed when a farmer's son was dismissed like a nobody. But today, where the sky itself had answered. The helicopter door opened, and out stepped a man so powerful that even the dean's face turned pale. Then he uttered four words, words that changed everything. The wind howled as the helicopter descended, kicking up dust and sending papers flying across the campus. Students shielded their faces, their conversations stopping mid-sentence. Professors peered out of their office windows, confused. The sound was deafening. Just yesterday, nobody would have imagined this scene. Yesterday, the poor farmer's son had walked out of this very campus, his face burning with shame. The entire class had laughed as the professor dismissed him like he was nothing. "You do not belong here," the professor had scoffed. "Go back to the fields where you came from." Laughter had filled the room, cold and cruel. The boy had clenched his fist but said nothing. He simply picked up his bag and walked away, his head down, disappearing through the grand doors of the elite university, a place where only the wealthy were welcome. But now, everything was different. The helicopter's massive steel doors swung open with a hiss. The crowd, which had gathered in stunned silence, gasped as a man in a tailored black suit stepped out. His presence alone sent chills down their spines. He was older, but his piercing eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen and built empires. The dean rushed outside, his forehead already beaded with sweat. He recognized that face. Everybody did. This was William Lancaster, a man whose name alone could silence rooms, a billionaire, a legend, a man who could crush this university with a single phone call. Students whispered in shock. Professors glanced at each other nervously. Why was he here? William Lancaster scanned the sea of stunned faces, then fixed his eyes on the professor. The same professor who had humiliated the farmer's son. The old billionaire took a step forward. His voice was calm, yet it cut through the air like a blade. "Where is my grandson?" Silence, thick, suffocating silence. The professor's face turned pale as if the blood had drained from his body. Grandson? His throat tightened. The boy he had dismissed, the poor farmer's son, was William Lancaster's grandson. Students exchanged stunned glances. Some pulled out their phones, recording the moment. This was history in the making. The dean stepped forward, forcing a nervous smile. "Mr. Lancaster, welcome to our campus. If I had known you were coming—" William Lancaster raised a hand. The dean shut up immediately. "I am not here for pleasantries," the billionaire said, his voice calm yet terrifying. He turned to the professor. "Yesterday, you dismissed a student from your class, a boy you thought was unworthy of this institution. I want you to repeat your exact words." The professor swallowed hard. His hands trembled. I do not recall." "Lies." That single word cut through the air like a whip. The crowd flinched. The billionaire took another step forward. "I asked my grandson to keep a low profile," Lancaster continued. "I wanted him to experience life without my name shielding him. But you—" He stared into the professor's eyes. "You judged him not by his intelligence, not by his character, but by his background." The professor opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His knees felt weak. William Lancaster turned to the crowd. "Tell me," he said, loud enough for every student to hear, "is this what education has become? A place where a brilliant young mind is mocked and discarded because he does not wear designer suits? Because he comes from the soil rather than skyscrapers?" Murmurs spread through the students. Some looked down, ashamed. Others nodded in agreement. Then from the back of the crowd, he stepped forward. The farmer's son. His clothes were still simple, his bag still worn out. But there was something different now. Confidence, strength, fire in his eyes. "I am here, grandfather," he said. Lancaster turned, his face softening for the first time. "Good." Then he looked back at the professor, his voice sharp again. "You made a mistake, and I do not tolerate mistakes." The professor's breath hitched, and then the real reckoning began. The professor felt the weight of 100 eyes burning into him. His knees wobbled and a cold sweat ran down his back. This could not be happening. Just yesterday, he had laughed at the farmer's son, tossing him out of his class like trash. And now he was standing before one of the most powerful men in the country. "Mr. Lancaster, the professor stammered, forcing a smile. "I had no idea he was your grandson." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. "And that is exactly the problem." A sharp hush fell over the crowd. "You did not judge him for his intelligence, his potential, or his work ethic," Lancaster continued. "You judged him because of where he came from. You thought he was beneath you." The professor swallowed hard. "You teach at one of the most prestigious institutions in the country," Lancaster said, his voice calm but sharp. "Yet you behave like an arrogant fool. You humiliated a student who could one day change the world. What does that say about you?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Students who had once laughed along with the professor now avoided his gaze. They had seen this man mock the boy. They had heard his cruel words. And now the consequences had arrived. The farmer's son took a step forward, his voice steady. "I never asked for special treatment. I never wanted my grandfather's name to protect me. I came here to learn, to prove myself. But instead of being judged for my abilities, I was thrown aside like I was nothing." The professor opened his mouth, searching for an excuse. But there was none. William Lancaster turned to the dean. "I will not allow my grandson, or any student, to be treated like this." His voice was quiet, but the power behind it was undeniable. "You will take immediate action." The dean wiped his sweaty forehead. "Mr. Lancaster, I assure you, we will investigate." "Investigate?" Lancaster's voice turned ice cold. "Number U will remove him. Today." The professor's heart nearly stopped. "Wait, please." Lancaster raised a hand, silencing him. "You chose to judge a student unfairly. Now you will understand what it feels like to be dismissed." The students gasped. The man who had thrown out the farmer's son was now being thrown out himself. The professor's face burned with humiliation as security stepped forward. His own lesson had turned against him. And as he was led away, the farmer's son stood tall, no longer just a dismissed student, but someone who had proven his worth to the world. The entire campus stood frozen, watching as security escorted the professor out. His face was pale, his hands trembling. The same man who had mocked a student for being unworthy was now the one being dismissed, this time with no second chances. Students whispered in shock. Some had once admired the professor's authority, but now they only saw a man who had let arrogance destroy his career. William Lancaster turned to his grandson, studying him carefully. Then he placed a hand on his shoulder. "You never needed my name to prove your worth," he said. "But remember this, when someone tries to belittle you, it says more about them than it does about you." The farmer's son looked at him, emotions swirling in his eyes. "I just wanted a chance," he said. "A fair chance. And now you will get it," Lancaster declared. He turned to the dean, his presence alone sending a shiver through the man's spine. "My grandson will remain a student here, and from now on, this university will not judge its students by their wealth, but by their potential. Is that understood?" The dean nodded so quickly it almost seemed like his head might fall off. Yes, of course, Mr. Lancaster." The billionaire's lips curled into a faint smile. "Good, because let me be clear, if I hear of anything like this happening again, I will make sure this entire institution is held accountable." The weight of his words settled over everyone. He was not making a threat. He was making a promise. As Lancaster turned back to the helicopter, the students erupted into cheers. Not for the billionaire, not for the power, but for the lesson that had been learned. The farmer's son, once humiliated and cast aside, had stood his ground. And today he had walked away not just as a student, but as a symbol of change. The blades of the helicopter roared to life. As the billionaire stepped inside, he glanced back at his grandson one last time. "Make me proud," he said. The farmer's son smiled. "I already am." With that, the helicopter lifted into the sky, leaving behind a story that would be told for generations. A story of justice, of dignity, and of a lesson learned the hard way.